We're all from the Center for International Governance Innovation, and we're really happy to have the rules for global finance here to help promote this. The Center for International Governance Innovation, if I could just make a quick plug, I am a senior fellow at CG as well as a professor at the University of Waterloo, a named fellow at Brookings. I'm here today with an excellent group of our graduate students from the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and they are on a CG Junior Fellowship. And as a part of the CG mandate and the CG Junior Fellowship, what we do is we try to identify global governance problems, and we try to improve and suggest ways of improving global governance. And this team of great grad students and I have been working since September, actually, on this project. And really, we identified a very interesting point where we have two organizations, the IMF, which is well known, the FSB, which is not as well known, working together on something called the early warning exercise. And quite interestingly, the early warning exercise is really about the premier, if you will, exercise, for lack of a better term, sorry for keep repeating that word, that is supposed to identify the potential risks in the global economy. So it is huge. It is obviously a big task, and we want to improve that because I think all of us here have a coordinated desire and view in wanting to continue to see global stability or hope to gain global stability, depending on your views on the matter today. So the brief here is about an attempt to suggest ways of improvement. It is a forward-looking piece, and what we'd really love from all of you who are in the room is to help us get this on the policy agenda. Anything you can do about distributing it to your mailing list, we have an e-copy. I'll just direct you to our website, cgonline.org. I'm very happy to give printed copies of this today. We are very happy to send your printed copies if you'd like to send them to your members. Distribute the link to the policy brief, and as much as possible, really get this on the policy agenda, because as you all know, good ideas that, if you will, are sounded off in an empty forest really has no value unless it gets on the agenda of policymakers. So we're really keenly interested as well in hearing from you on how to effectively do that. So on that note, I'd like to introduce you to the great team. Skylar Brooks, who is a graduate student in the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo in global governance. Dustin Lance, as well, graduate student MA in global governance at the University of Waterloo. And Michael Cockburn, who is a master's in international public policy at Wilfrid Laurier University. And our other co-author who couldn't be here with us is Warren Clark, who is a PhD candidate in the Global Governance Balsillie School program at Wilfrid Laurier University. All of us share in common that we are, again, a part of the Balsillie School of International Affairs and also members of CG, either as junior fellow or as a senior fellow. So on that note, I'd like us to first start off with Michael, who will give us a little bit of a context and background into the FSB-IMF early warning exercise.
Thank you, Vespa. So the global financial crisis has shown the need for stronger surveillance and better foresight in financial governance. The failure of both domestic and international regulatory bodies to foresee the 2008 global financial crisis demonstrated significant gaps in our regulatory and financial architecture. The global and systemic nature of the crisis spurred intensive efforts towards improving global cooperation in financial governance. In April 2009, the newly convened G20 Leaders Forum produced its first major institutional innovation at the end of their summit in London. A communique at the end of the summit admitted the failure of the current global regulatory framework, stating that the major failures in the financial sector and in financial regulations and supervision were fundamental causes of the crisis. And they committed themselves to creating a globally consistent supervisory and regulatory framework. To this end, the G20 established the Financial Stability Board, which we'll refer to as the FSB or the board for the rest of the presentation. The new body was intended to share best practices between regulators and enhance the requirements for macroprudential oversight. Now, one of the major practices undertaken by the FSB was the carrying out of early warning exercises, which we'll call exercises or exercise or EWE throughout, in conjunction with the IMF. The rapidity of financial activity and the sprawling nature of the global financial system have created a situation whereby crises could arise in unexpected areas at unexpected times. The early warning exercise was thus conceived of a way of perpetually scanning the horizon to kind of see what was just over the hill, what kind of problems we might have in the future, and was to use the analytical powers of both the IMF and the FSB. Now, there's a differentiation of roles in the process. The IMF itself, it takes a more quantitative look, looking at macro financial flows within and throughout regions, whereas the FSB has more of a regulatory viewpoint. They're looking more at the qualitative issues of the actual financial governance. Policymakers argued that by dividing responsibilities between the two organizations, they would be able to glean insights into the international financial architecture that they couldn't get on their own. The greater regulatory expertise of the FSB, obtained through their direct engagement with national banks and domestic regulatory and supervisory agencies, would complement the traditional expertise of the IMF based on macro-financial linkages. Now, the reasons for the inclusion of the FSB, and there's some debate about this, it seems to fall to two camps. There's the political and the practical. On the political side, there seems to be that the FSB was included because of a broader sense, a drive for inclusion in global decision-making in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. On the other hand, several government officials as well as individuals in the FSB say that the FSB brings a different source of knowledge as well to the exercise. One FSB official stated that the FSB has access to data that would otherwise be missed by the IMF because they have access to national data banks that the IMF doesn't have access to. And given their proximity to and access to national information, they would bring a sort of political economy perspective to the more econometric analysis of the IMF, was the belief. So before I hand it off to Skylar, I'm going to just map out what the process of the early warning exercise is. The exercise is largely done separately until it gets closer to the actual spring and fall annual meetings. So first I'll talk about the IMF process, and then I'll talk about the FSB process, and then I'll talk about the actual exercise. So for the IMF, they have a group called the Early Warning Group, which is made up of about 8 individuals from strategy, policy and review, fiscal affairs, monetary and capital markets, and research. And they have a series of meetings about once a week, 2 to 3 months before the spring and fall annual meetings, brainstorming about some of the potential financial risks. There's some external consultations. It seems to be limited to a couple conference calls to a couple people in systemically important financial institutions. But it's mostly in-house work based off of the data that the IMF already has. So using that data, and after a series of brainstorming sessions, they come to a conclusion about which risks deserve the greatest attention. They analyze them in a bit more detail, and then they formulate what they call the early warning list, which is the IMF's idea of what the low probability, high risk events are that are just on the horizon. On the FSB side, the FSB Secretariat asks members of the Analytical Group on Vulnerabilities, or AGV, which is a subset of the Standing Committee on the Assessment of Vulnerabilities, one of the 3 standing committees of the FSB, to go and look at specific issues. So these people in the AGV are sort of members of national banks. They're, deputy governors or lower in central banks, and they'll go back to their national bank. They'll talk and they'll figure out kind of what is to do about all of the issue. They'll come back, they'll report to the Secretariat, and they work with the Secretariat in this iterative process for a couple of months. Eventually, they present their results to the SCAV, and after a little bit of editing and revision and further consultation, they prepare their own version of the early warning list. And so before the actual meeting of the International Monetary and Financial Committee, which is who they present to, they consult with one another to make sure that their numbers are in line with one another and that they sort of have similar ideas. And then they each prepare their own 15-minute presentation, which they present to the IMFC. After the presentations are done, there's nothing in the way of a structured dialogue, and there's no discussions or publications. But what seems to be useful is that the next day there's a closed-door breakfast meeting of high-ranking members within the IMFC. There's no scripts, there's no assistants, and it just seems to be an honest dialogue between different members of the IMFC on the issues that they had discussed the previous day. And past attendees have stated that this private informal discussion held at the meetings was just as important, if not more important, than what happens at the formal IMFC meetings. So that seems to be the main effect that it has on the thought of national policymakers, is it forms this discussion for them the next day. So that's the context of the exercise, and that's the process of the exercise. I'm going to hand it over to Skylar now, and he's going to discuss some of the problems.
May I just to reiterate, so I apologize, but I just want to emphasize this because to make sure that you heard this right. This is based on 15-minute presentation. The early warning exercise was to warn about the global financial system is based on 2 15-minute presentations, one by the IMF, one by the FSB, to the IMFC. Nothing is printed, nothing is if you will, documented. That's the entire global financial system based on 2 presentations.
Is it 50 or 15?
15.
Total also,
half an hour.
They're not allowed to tell anybody outside of the IMFC what their presentation was on, so we don't actually know what they say in the presentations.
Okay. No worries. So I'd like to start by emphasizing the fact that the early warning exercise is critical to preventing future financial crises. The issue, however, is that there are currently several problems in the design and implementation of the exercise that undermine or constrain its overall effectiveness. In a sentence, the early warning exercise suffers from unclear goals, a lack of coordination, geographical separation, insufficient organizational capacity, and ad hoc procedures. So let me just walk through these problems one by one. The first and most basic problem relates to the clarity of the early warning exercise's purpose. Now, there's still disagreement and even slight confusion over exactly what the exercise ought to be focusing on. This is largely a technical debate about whether the exercise should focus exclusively on the low probability, high impact tail risks, as they're called, or whether the exercise should focus more on the high probability or higher probability impending risks. Aside from this debate, others have suggested more modest goals for the exercise, such as promoting structured dialogue among national officials. The point and the problem here is that without a clear consensus over the purpose of the early warning exercise, there's nothing really to prevent the various actors from working at cross purposes. Now, the second and perhaps the largest problem concerns coordination. Here, it's important to remember that the early warning exercise is founded on the idea that the IMF and FSB, having different but essentially complementary mandates and skill sets, are able to work together to generate a more comprehensive, more complete understanding of global economic risks and vulnerabilities. So in essence, the 2 organizations together can generate insights that neither one of them could on its own. However, in practice, IMF-FSB coordination has actually been quite scarce. Now, this runs in complete contrast with how the early warning exercise is supposed to work, according to the official document published by the IMF. It also undermines the purpose or value of the EWE's collaborative approach, to harness or leverage the comparative strengths of the IMF and FSB in order to generate a more comprehensive view or understanding of global economic risks. So clearly, coordination is very important here, and a lack of coordination is a problem and a big area for improvement. The third challenge concerns location, and the problem here is pretty simple. The IMF is located here in Washington, and the FSB is in Basel, Switzerland. I think quite naturally, this great distance is only going to further impede coordination between the 2 organizations. Now, if the FSB were located here in Washington, there's no doubt that there'd be a great deal more of coordination, cooperation, and just general contact between the 2 organizations. The fourth challenge or problem is insufficient organizational capacity at the FSB. Now, the FSB is currently in the process of doubling its staff. It's expanding. It's moving from approximately 20 staff members to 40. Nevertheless, it's absolutely dwarfed by the 400 employees in the MCM department alone at the IMF. Now, it seems pretty clear to us that the FSB punches well above its weight. Still, without substantial resources, it's difficult to imagine how the FSB could serve as an effective 4th pillar of global economic governance, as Timothy Geithner had suggested. This too seems to be the perception at the IMF, where staff members don't really see the FSB as an equal partner. When asked about the relationship between the 2 organizations, IMF staff members remarked that the IMF does the majority of the work in this process, and one went as far as to say that the FSB wasn't necessary to the process at all. That said, I think it's likely that these perceptions or misperceptions have further detracted from cooperation between the two organizations. The fifth problem concerns the ad hoc, informal, and irregular nature of the external consultations carried out by the IMF as part of the early warning exercise. In our opinion, regularized, structured consultations with academics, think tanks, systemically important financial institutions could be a very valuable exercise. But our research shows that the current consultation process lacks formality, lacks regularity, and lacks overall structure. As a result, effective consultations are not fully being taken advantage of. The sixth and final problem concerns the presentation of the early warning exercise findings, and ultimately the informational feedback loop that kind of completes this process. Now, the primary channel through which the early warning exercise findings are transmitted back to national level officials is through the semi-annual presentation to the IMFC. Because of the confidentiality of this entire exercise, there is no supporting document to accompany these presentations. So, it is thus from the 30 minutes of presentation time that IMFC members are expected to absorb, process, retain, and ultimately convey back crucial and complex information to their national capitals. And I think this is quite problematic. First, the brevity of the presentations, coupled with the complexity of the information being presented, is going to test one's capacity to absorb everything that's being thrown at them. One must then process or comprehend the implications of this information, and that may ultimately depend on the depth of one's knowledge about complex financial or macroeconomic issues. IMFC members must also, of course, retain the information, store it in their brains over a period of time, making sure that none of it leaks out over a hectic and busy weekend. And finally, IMFC members must effectively convey early warning list information back to the relevant policymakers in their respective countries. Now, there's nothing to guarantee that any of this actually gets done, and there's much to suggest that some of it will not. If this is not getting done, then the early warning exercise is not doing its job. So now I've laid out the 6 critical challenges that face the early warning exercise, and Dustin's going to walk us through some of the solutions.
Thanks, Skylar. Skylar's done such a good job of explaining those challenges that you might be able to infer what our proposals are. Nonetheless, I'll explicate them for you. We have 6 proposals to enhance coordination and effectiveness of this exercise. First, our first proposal is to clarify the purpose and the scope of the exercise. As Skylar explained, disagreement persists as to whether the EWE should focus on tail risks or mid to high probability risks. In 2010, then IMF Deputy Managing Director John Lipsky said that the purpose of the EWE is, quote, to identify the most relevant tail risks, to demonstrate how the possible emergence of these risks could be recognized, and to specify the policy challenges that would need to be implemented if they were to materialize. Recently, however, participants in our study emphasized that the purpose of the exercise is far less ambitious. It's simply to facilitate a structured dialogue, as Skylar mentioned. And we argue that without a clear consensus on the EWE's purpose, it is necessarily suboptimal. Moreover, uncertainty about the purpose of the exercise and the nature of the tail risk, nature of the risks identified, undermines its ability to gain traction with policymakers. Our second proposal is to diversify and formalize consultations with outside stakeholders. Greater emphasis should be given and a more systematic approach should be taken to consultations with market participants, academics, and authorities within emerging market economies to diversify the information and perspectives that feed into the exercise. Our third proposal is to increase the organizational capacity of the FSB, and this is, although this is underway, its comparatively minimal resources impedes robust coordination with the IMF in preparation of the exercise specifically, and policymakers recognize this weakness. The FSB should consider increasing staff levels in line with the greater expectations and responsibilities being placed upon it. Indeed, it is possible to increase the capacity of the Secretariat without undermining the member-driven structure of the FSB, which officials place a high value on. Our fourth proposal is to emphasize areas of productive disagreement between the two organizations. Several past attendees
of the presentations have told us that they find it quite useful when productive disagreements occur between the two organizations. This is because hearing competing perspectives on a given issue can be a valuable means of sparking constructive dialogue and debate. Our fifth proposal is that the core findings of the exercise should be published. The IMF's flagship publications, the GFSR, which is the Global Financial Stability Report, and the World Economic Outlook, gained significant traction with mid and high-level national officials. In contrast, the EWE's lack of publication hampers its ability to inform discourse among officials. Attendees at the IMF-C presentations receive a lot of heavily weighted information from two 15-minute presentations. If all of this dense information is supposed to feed back to national capitals, then it should not depend solely on the abilities and discretion of attendees to circulate all of this information informally. And objections to publishing the findings of the exercise are usually premised on the market-sensitive nature of its findings. Yet several public and private sector actors who participate in our study are in favor of the publication, suggesting that this objection is not sufficient to preclude the creation of a publication based on the exercise's findings. And the sixth proposal that we argue is that the FSB should establish a liaison office here in Washington, D.C. Although some actors, including a member of the FSB Secretariat in a recent news article, which you may have seen, have praised the level of coordination between the two organizations, others have explicitly stated to us that interaction between the two organizations has been challenged. And just to sort of expand on what Skylar said, that it doesn't take a PhD in financial economics or regulation to understand that the coordination of a regulatory process would benefit from its actors working within the same proximity. And it is worth noting that the World Health Organization established an office here in Washington to improve its coordination with the World Bank and the IMF. So clearly there are benefits to taking this type of action. So to recap our 6 proposals. 1, to clarify the purpose and scope of the exercise. 2, to diversify and formalize consultations with outside stakeholders. 3, to increase the organizational capacity of the FSB as it relates to the exercise. Number 4, to emphasize areas of productive disagreement between the two organizations. Proposal 5 is that the core findings of the exercise should be published. And Proposal 6 is the FSB should establish a liaison office here in Washington. In conclusion, the exercise was established as a part of a broader call to improve national level intelligence regarding the character of systemic risk in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Nevertheless, weaknesses in the exercise's processes undermine its efficacy. There are a number of ways that the process surrounding the exercise may be improved. We've outlined them here. In particular, collaboration between the IMF and FSB needs to be strengthened in order to leverage their comparative advantages. Although the exercise will remain challenging due to the complexity of the task, implementing the recommendations we've outlined here, we argue, would greatly improve the overall effectiveness of this very important process.
Thank you. And we look forward to Nathan from New Rules for Global Finance to give us some comments.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for inviting me, and thank you for doing this policy brief. Looking at the early warning exercise, and as an organization that follows the FSB fairly closely, it's one of the things we do, don't see a lot on this, ever. Not much is done. FSB doesn't publish anything, as you highlighted. So it's good to get a recap of what's happening, where it stands, particularly because this is such an important thing, especially considering the FSB's mandate. Basically, it's twofold. One is to, so quote unquote, prevent further financial crises, and the other is coordinate global financial regulation. So that's what this U is really at the heart of this, is really to get at. And I call it U, I guess it's not the best acronym. Maybe that's why there's not too much coordination yet. But
never thought of that.
Never thought of that.
U, right.
Yeah. Recommendation 7, fix the name.
Yeah. No, but these are some good recommendations, and I think coordination at any policy level, domestic, internationally, is really international cooperation on those policy issues is so complicated and difficult, but it's particularly challenging in regards to financial regulation. And there's seriously a need for better cooperation between the FSB and IMF on this. And I'm glad you guys are following it because, like you said, it's not something that we see a lot of, and I think there should be a stronger push for improving this coordination. Just two things. I have several questions. We'll open it up here. I think that's one probably. But one is, initially, what is the exercise? Because when I think of exercise, I think of something that the Federal Reserve does when it runs its tests of systemically important banks at the domestic level. And this just so far seems like a process of developing a list of issues and vulnerabilities in the global financial system. And it's something that you mentioned that the Standing Committee at the FSB on assessing vulnerabilities does. The IMF has a seat at that on that working group, on that Standing Committee. I don't know if the FSB has anyone who listens in or sits on any of the IMF groups. And it's different approaches to the IMF is its IMF staff, reporting to IMF staff, whereas the FSB is, you have secretary working on these issues in these working groups, and they're reporting to central bank governors, deputy ministers, all these people, and the standing committees. And then that's kind of getting watered down further as it goes to the plenary, and then there's approval at the national level, where the IMF's just all inside. So maybe there's some things to draw from that too. But yeah, I guess I'll go from there. Maybe I'll have a couple more comments, but.
I'd love to open it to everyone. If I could encourage you all to ask questions, and if you could also give us ideas on furthering this process in terms of getting on the agenda as well. Sir, yes.
So,
do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, no problem.
So it's familiar, so I feel like I know you, but I can't remember.
So, my name is Arturo Porcegansky, and I'm a professor of international finance here at American University. And so, I don't have any inside track on this thing, but my impression is the way it probably came about is, back in the aftermath of the crisis, some policymakers said, like, gee, maybe we should have some people who have nothing better to do but think out of the box, think about the tail risks, that way they can give us a heads up whenever something might happen or something like that. And that's how probably this got going, and that's probably what explains the way it's structured and the way it works. In other words, I think you're taking it way too seriously. They just wanted to, because so many people in these organizations are trapped by a routine of, it's April the 19th, we have to get the report on, Bangladesh out next week, or we have to get the report out on the housing market in Europe, people are trapped into a certain routines given by certain priorities and certain commitments and so on. So they just wanted to, I think, free up some people to, as I say, think of the unthinkable and so on. And unless you take it very seriously, then it makes more sense the way they do it. That it is fairly informal, that they only get half an hour at a very important meeting, or supposedly very important meeting, and mostly they just they make use mostly of the IMF resources, because after all, as you said, the IMF has an enormous amount of staff engaged in producing what it produces, the WEO and the Global Financial Stability Report and all these other things. So I think that may explain some of the gap between what you're observing. All your observations are correct, but maybe, as I say, you're taking it all too seriously, and this was never meant to be something that has an agenda and that publishes stuff and that has a PR arm with the rest of the world and so on and so forth. I think, and by the way, you'd be surprised about how decisions are made, whether at the White House or at Citibank or a lot of things are done in 15 minutes and there's no memos written and so on and so forth. So I think it's okay. I don't think there is any proof, that you need an army of people to come up with some bright ideas. You need an army of people to crunch a lot of data and produce a lot of reports and so on. But unless you have the expectation that really some guys and gals working, out of the basement of the fund or of the BIS are really going to tell us what are the things that are going to blindside us in the future, which I don't. I have zero expectation of that. Then you could moderate a little bit your expectations and maybe come closer to the way some of these actually work. I may be totally wrong. Maybe it should be a very serious exercise and therefore it should be bolstered in all the ways that you suggest, which make absolute sense. But I say ask yourselves whether maybe this was never meant to be what you would like it to be.
I think that's a very, very valid point. Really important. If you have a cell phone that's near a microphone, that often does that. But no, I think it's a really important point.
It's you.
Figures the IMF would set it off. I'm joking. No, I think that's absolutely right. I think the question, and maybe it's perhaps, from our own study of this, we did find high expectation. And maybe this is partly time period, in the sense that, post-financial crisis, immediately after, there was a lot of, I think, buzz and policy buzz about using the wealth of knowledge in this great institution to be used toward doing more than just, I think, sort of backward analysis, to really be forward-looking and be able to predict and warn of these crises. Because at the end of the day, this is, and I mean by that the IMF, I know we're in the bank, the premier organization that has the talent, the data, the knowledge, the time, and the public good, right? I mean, it's not a profit and based incentive structure to actually do these studies. So if not here, then where? But I think you're absolutely right in the sense that one of the things we should take into consideration is that over time, as we move away from the financial crisis, urgency has obviously gone down, and there's complacency at the moment, I think, in the international policy community about the notion of there being another great recession. But this, I think, is, this comes to the core of whether or not there is consensus both in academic and policy circles as to whether or not this exercise is needed. And if that still stands, I would hope that some of what we're talking about today is at least considered in a sense to improve the process. But I agree with you completely, Arturo, and I really appreciate that commentary. Thank you.
If I could, I just wanted, before the next question, say I also agree that's with your comment, but just maybe the issue of coordination might be something that still should be emphasized, particularly as the IMF intensifies its work in technical assistance, as it's still lending and financing, but it's really intensified its work in technical assistance areas, creating new technical assistance centers all over. In Africa, I think there's 4 or 5. They just opened one in Thailand, just for Myanmar and Laos, and other regions as well. And this technical assistance has always been about fiscal policy and technical advice, but it's also incorporating a lot of financial sector reform things now. And if the FSB is also kind of broadcasting and trying to take these things from the national levels, and they also have regional consultative groups that are supposed to take the advice from the plenary at the FSB and kind of implement these measures in their home countries. I think there should be less conflicting advice maybe from both. Maybe there's not, I don't know. But just maybe some better coordination that way. The advice is maybe a little more on track with each other, particularly given the IMF's capacity and the lower capacity of the FSB at this time at least.
Marjorie had a...
Yeah, I work for the IMF. Besma, as you know, we have a very rigorous review process for all of our country papers. And those papers have to go through the departments that are involved in the EWE, SPR, MCN, FAD. I wonder whether you get a sense of how much from what they find as part of the EWE exercise is reflected in staff reports in the World Economic Outlook and the GFSR.
Yeah.
I can't believe this is all in a vacuum and it's not being trickled down into the reports that are being published. So just...
And we did ask the question as to whether or not the early warning group takes the views of the area department. And indeed, there is in their early warning group over about 2 to 3 months, every once in a while, the relevant area department staff are brought into it. But as far as to my knowledge, that once the EWG list has come out, that is not brought back in a formal mechanism to the area departments. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't know of a mechanism where that list, and definitely not the presentation to the IMFC, which is meant to incorporate both the findings of the FSB and the IMF, ever make it back to area department country reports. I would love to be wrong on that. And something worth looking into. That's a very good point, because that would be, and one of the things that we want to do, again, is to strengthen this exercise to ensure that there is some feedback loop into the policy-making circle at the domestic level. Because at the end of the day, if this just stays on the international level and doesn't trickle down to the countries, there's really no point. There's no implementation. I mean, at the end of the day, the IMF does not do laws. It is the sovereignty of governments. So we want this to come back into the feedback loop. Our impression was that it's from the IMFC on the assumption, and this is one thing that I think is really key here, on the assumption that these are finance ministers, primarily at the IMFC, okay, that are supposed to go back to their departments and brief them. I mean, you know, when we had a chance to talk to government officials, this was really a backward thing. In other words, you don't get a finance minister going back to their capital and say, guys, let's get together. I want to tell you what I had learned at the IMFC. That's not the structure of policy making at the national level. So where is that knowledge going? The hope is that actually it'll happen on the FSB side, in fact, through the working groups where you do have those mid to senior level policy officials, mostly from central banks, take that knowledge back to their capital. So again, there's a mismatch there in different levels of where they are in the policy process at the domestic level. But I think that would be really important for us to further, and I'd love your help, Marjorie, on finding out whether or not that takes place. Please.
Yeah, I'm Eve. I'm a project analyst for public funding in DRC. So I would love to find out how many crises the IMF have prevented it, and then what it is, like the life cycle of a crisis. Does it exist, like there is like a life cycle of crisis, so it can be prevented?
I mean, that's a fantastic point. I mean, I would say very little, and if any. You know, some people would say that Argentina, the IMF knew that Argentina was vulnerable, for example, but couldn't for fear of, I mean, if you read Paul Bluestein's book, for example, that's something that comes out in his book. But all in all, I'd say most crises are not predictable. And one of the things I'd love to get Arturo's perspective on this, because this is in your area of expertise, is the question, and Isabel, if you don't mind, I'm putting you on the spot, but do you believe that this organization, i.e. the IMF and FSB, have the capacity, the human capacity, to ever really predict a crisis? I mean, are we chasing something that can never be done?
I have a little anecdote to that. When we interviewed the FSB, one of the questions we asked was, have the results from your list ever actually come to fruition, or have you? And yes, it did. And we couldn't ask them what it was. They wouldn't tell us what it was. And we asked them if they had ever done, if any of the problems that they had brought up had ever been solved because of them bringing it up. And they were pretty confident that they had in fact stopped some crises from happening. But of course, we can't find out what those crises were because they can't disclose it to the public. So I don't know. They seem to think that they are preventing crises, but we can't actually know from the outside.
So, any thoughts on that?
Well, I just had a thought on a related issue about the information flow back that you're concerned about. Again, if there's nothing really newsworthy, people won't bother to relay it. But trust me, if the EWE people in those 15 or 30 minutes were to say something like, it's a minor risk, but Brazil is going off the rails, and if it continues to go in this direction, it could really make major international financial waves in 2014, say, trust me, it will go back. Now, first of all, the Brazilian representative right there will have a fit, and he'll make it known. But secondly, that kind of thing will flow back. People will, they'll talk about it in the men's room, in the ladies' room, and every place else. The problem with many of these things is that most of the time it's couched in so many if, when, maybe, scenario, detail, whatever, it's because you have all those finance ministers around the table that you don't want to offend and throat slam on some, pie on your face, that it's mush. So if you look, also backing up, if you look at any of the IMF's reports, whether it's the WE or whatever, or the country reports, they all contain some discussion of tail side risks. That's a big improvement.
Yes.
It may not be their central scenario, it shouldn't be their central scenario, but it is. So that's why I say I think that the IWI is just one point in a very long chain of information. And if you find that oftentimes it's empty, it's because it deserves to be empty. But trust me, that if they really came up with a nugget, I'm sure it would make the rounds.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
I'm Larry Goodman. I'm the president of the Center for Financial Stability in New York, and we look actively at these issues. We look at financial market issues, how instruments actually trade, risks in the derivatives markets, risk in the repo market, global macro risks, as well as regulatory and legal risks. So we looked long and hard at these issues, and I applaud you for bringing this up and addressing it. And I also applaud the IMF for actually doing this, for rolling up their sleeves and engaging in this process. It's an important process. There is some history here, and the history is that after the Asian crisis, there was a flurry of activity to put together systems, and there was a tremendous amount of progress that was made. And I think that the building blocks have been put in place at that point in time that are really useful for these types of exercises. You've talked a lot about process, and process is important. One area where I would also encourage you to think is engaging fund staff. Fund staff has a tremendous amount of knowledge. I think that harnessing that knowledge within that organization, you can do a tremendous job at identifying not only the risks, but when they're likely to present, and if they do present, how bad they're going to be. The second process that you talked about was the IMFC. And frankly, the IMFC is the wrong place to deal with this. The IMFC is probably okay if you want to do a 15-minute touch at a high level for all of the reasons that you've cited. It makes much more sense to have an open and free-flowing dialogue so that if a risk does present, and you can have a logical time window, whether it's 3 to 12 months or 6 to 24 months. But you need to be able to contact people quickly so that they can engage rapidly, and you need to have an organization set up so that the process can work swiftly. So I think the frequency and the touch is important. I agree about the IMFC. It's the wrong place and the wrong time. You can use it judiciously to sort of have that high-level touch and say that we're still here. But it needs to be structured in such a way that you're levering fund staff much more broadly than simply the group of 8 or however many people are in the group, and then ensuring that the flow of information gets out in the right spot.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Hi, I'm Rodrigo Valderrama, Plantation International. It's an independent little organization. Just with regard to your question, I think if they're doing their job, everything should run smoothly, so it's kind of tough for them to show what they've implemented and what they've done. On the other hand, following what's going on, maybe if you guys can get information as to when missions are going to different countries, when something's like out of culture, like they're sending too many missions, or all of a sudden a special SWAT group, because they have them here at the IMF, then you get a chance to look at the country and begin to follow up and see what happens.
Thank you. Other comments that we really would appreciate any suggestions on furthering this forward in terms of putting this on the sort of highlighting this and advertising our brief. We really appreciate any thoughts on that. We have some great grad students here all looking for internships as well. So if any of your fine organization wants some bright stars, I'm offering them up to you guys.
Maybe just one last thing that
Please.
There is a lot of talking among policymakers on the sides, in the hallways, in cocktail parties, in hotel lobbies and so on. I mean, for instance, the central bankers, right? They all come to Basel every other month, just about, and they have 2-3 days of off-camera meetings, and what I'm told from people who go to that, they find it very useful because there they can. Maybe the central bank president of Brazil can tell the others, we're having some issues here, let me tell you about it, but, definitely we're not going public with this, and so, so that's a very important forum, the Basel get-togethers of the central bank presidents. Did it prevent the 2008 thing? No. Yeah. But if you look back at which documents were the most insightful in terms of what happened, it was the BIS annual report. I would say if you have to read any one document, some of us may have our own preferences, but the BIS annual report is really prescient. And it's done with a fraction of the staffing that all the other reports put out is done. So obviously it's not necessarily a question of numbers, and it's also a question of using what other people are doing, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. Say that the IMF is doing a very good job in what it does, whatever that is, which may not be anticipating the next crisis, by the way. You can use that into your work and your deliberations and whatnot. So what I'm saying is there are many opportunities for policymakers to meet and discuss and even talk about low probability events. So let's not think that the world rests on these poor 8 souls who get together. It doesn't. So it's a compliment. As I say, if I were Madame Lagarde or and if I want to have some people who have nothing to do but tell me about the low probability risks. And I'll keep that in mind for the next 6 months as I read the boring reports that I get from my staff about what's going on in, country X, Y, or Z, or situation, A, B, C. That's fine. But don't be misled into thinking that these are the only people, whether in the public sector or in the private sector, trying to guess where the next crisis is coming from. This happens all days long in all kinds of contexts, in all kinds of places.
Yeah, sorry, I came a little bit late to this session. I was at the end of poverty, and it's like 1,000 times more people, but I find it's actually more relevant. One of the things I would like to bring to the table here is that I heard a lot of good things at the end about big institutions like IMF, BIS, and they're all doing great work. I represent a small NGO. We're based in Toronto, called the Toronto Centre for Financial Services Leadership. And what we do, actually, we've been around since 1998, in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. And we actually think of it as boots on the ground. Like, we actually send people to various countries, and we work directly with the financial services supervisors. Now, they're obsessed with this issue of crisis. It's one thing not to read about a crisis about a specific country in a report, because nobody wants to air their dirty laundry. But when you close the room and you start talking about it, they all get into that. And some of the programs are country-specific, some of them are regional. So in those regional programs, more to your point, the central bankers or heads of supervisory agencies get to talk to one another. Next time, if there's a problem, they actually can pick up the phone and talk to one another. And then with cooperation with the World Bank and IMF, we actually put together crisis simulations. We walk them through a crisis. not just from a technical perspective, but also we look at role playing. Like we would ask you to be the Minister of Finance, we ask you to be someone from the media, and have that interplay. We talk about 2 or 3 fictitious banks in 2 or 3 fictitious countries, and one of them fails. And what does that mean? Is that a systemic failure, or is that a one-off? And what are the decision trees for that? Because there's big implications, right? So I think when you look at it from that perspective, you see that there's the good work that's being done in various big reports and big organizations may stay out in that cloud unless you actually are on the ground doing it. And this is not necessarily everybody from the large organizations, large IFIs, will be able to do all of that piece. So the quality of that interaction with the local officials, because as I said, when you close the door, they're petrified. They don't want to be the next Cyprus. They don't want to be the next whatever. They just want to make sure that their country can withstand a crisis. And I think that's a dimension to the conversation that probably should be inserted in one way or another.
Thank you. That's really helpful. This is really helpful. I'm looking at the Bretton Woods here.
I have to apologize for having arrived so late, so I feel rather...
But you're going to say something.
No. I'm here to listen. I'm afraid I couldn't attend earlier, but it is, of course, highly relevant to our work.
I mean, just to fill in the silence, I mean, and to respond to a few of the terrific, very relevant points that were made, I think that one of the advantages to publishing this type of report, if we do want to be ambitious and frankly optimistic about our ability to foresee crises or potential, weak spots, that they may be 2 or 3 years down the line, and it may be these low probability scenarios. But if we do want to kind of start to build towards a culture of forward thinking, looking into the future instead of being constantly in the present or constantly reactionary, then we do want to publish this type of thing, at least to get it into the different national ministries, right? To get it into the different financial ministries, and have the bureaucrats, having the people who are making policy, at least have this on their agenda and see it, so that if it does come up in 3 years, they think, okay, I've heard of this, I'm familiar with this, we've been thinking about this for the last 2 years. Also, I think that, as you mentioned, critical information will flow back. It will make its way back. But sometimes, with some of this stuff, I fear that it's not always going to flow back, and there's not always going to be a guarantee that it is. And some of the interviews that we did, revealed that some of the deputy level, still high-level bureaucrats, high-level policymakers were saying, when the minister comes back from this meeting, if he wants to share something with us, he will. But you can't just march up to the minister and say, what did you learn here? That's not how it works. But it still may be useful information for these people to be getting. And it's good if we can kind of spread the information as wide as possible. I think also a final point there is that because this is future-oriented, this is forward-looking, and many of the IMFC members are essentially politicians who don't necessarily want to or have the incentive to act on some of these future-oriented policies. They may also not have the incentive to bring this back, to champion some of these things. And this is, this is prevention stuff. This is looking at vulnerabilities and risk points. So it may be necessary to put some of the mechanisms or put some of the policies in place 3 years in advance, but they may not have the incentive to bring this back and champion it if it's a crisis that will manifest in 3 years. So I think that publishing it is...
And publication also ensures institutional memory is documented. It also ensures that we have a system whereby if there is a change in government, clearly, as we noted, finance ministers are subject to electoral cycles. If we don't have that kind of, I think, feeding of the information to the technocratic level, which is what we want to get here, is that it doesn't stay at what are the political elected official level, but that it makes its way back into the technocratic bureaucratic level, we can ensure, hopefully, that this will be addressed if there is, for example, a change of government, for example, some of the other errors. But with all due respect to what I think Eric Turris had noted, which is that this is stuff that will be picked up. Our concern is that it may be the subtler things that aren't picked up, or there is an incentive not to.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, you've emphasized a lot of the informality that goes on, and the informality is very important, and we emphasize that seems to be the main feedback mechanism. But be it that you talk about this in a closed breakfast, or you talk about it in the hallways or in the bathroom stall, it might just stay there, and there's a risk that it stays there if it stays as being an informal practice. And I think that was one of the things we were really focused on repairing, was making sure that there's always a light shone on this stuff by making it a bit more formal, by making it a bit more public, and making it something that we make sure more people are talking about, rather than a couple of people at like 11 o'clock at night in a boardroom and then it never gets mentioned again. And so, with all due respect to everything that you said, we think that our recommendations are kind of just like, the informality is great, but we want to take a different approach here.
I was wondering, you must have asked this question, why don't you publish it? What was the answer that you got?
Market sensitivity.
That doesn't concern you that if you release a list of countries that are vulnerable, that market is not going to react, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy?
So in fact, we spoke to people in the market sector, particularly people next door to the IIF, who said there was nothing in the EWE that could not be shared that wasn't out there already, according to them. We also talked to people in the public sector who do similar kinds of early warning exercises domestically and say it's never been a self-fulfilling prophecy to do any sort of damage domestically. So while we respect that is a valid fear, there is some, I think, legitimate sort of pushback on that, because as you know, the BIS report, the GFSRs, the WEOs, I mean, all of those contain really interesting information that one could say has market sensitivity. It's possible, if construed, or misconstrued. I think that there is an art in doing it properly, obviously, but it can be done, is what we kind of got the sense of this. And if at minimum, it should be at minimum a sort of internally distributed white paper, if not for public consumption. But at minimum, there should be something that makes it to the capitals that can be guaranteed to be fed back into the technocratic process.
One thing that I would add is, it is consistent with the IMF's transparency policy, which says that staff reports, before they're published, any market-sensitive information will be removed. So it is consistent with our own transparency policy. It's not an exception.
If I can add to what Besma just said, given everything that Besma just said, it seems that there are practically two things that happen when a public administration publishes potentially market-sensitive stuff or potentially risky stuff. So, the private sector's probably already thought of this. On the one hand, now people are thinking, oh, this gives credence to our fears. On the other hand, it's, oh, the proper authorities have recognized that there's an issue now, and now they have time to actually deal with it. So, on the one hand, it adds a bit of fear that this might actually happen. On the other hand, now these people also know that the issue is potentially being addressed, and kind of eases tensions about, like, okay, we know that, say, something's going to happen with the euro, or we think something might happen with the euro 4 years down the road, but at least these people know it too, and they have 4 years now that they're going to be working on this to try to fix it.
Because I feel like if, for example, you talk about market sensitivity, if you say something's going to happen to the euro, and it doesn't happen, and the market crash because of your projection, so you're not going to be well anymore. So I have a question to find out, what's going to be the next crisis? So in the near future. So do you guys know what's going to be the next crisis? So what's the purpose of this? So if we can now project what's going to be the next crisis. So we don't know it. So because crisis is policy making. So we don't know exactly how Japan or Asia are going to react for a certain policy. So it's something we cannot prevent. So let it happen. And then we're going to learn from it, and then we'll move on.
Creative destruction.
The nature of a crisis is that you didn't identify the issues that created the crisis, right? Otherwise, there would be no crisis.
And this is really aimed at looking for the weak spots and patching up the holes along the way, right? Rather than identifying what's the next big crisis and how's it going to explode. We're just trying to look to the future and say, these are the weak points. We need to address them. Those can be identified.
I think all too often with all due respect to this lady here, the IMF people, because they're not in the markets when they're doing the studies, they dumb down the impact of their studies, and they assume, for either internal reasons or keep the information reasons, to just keep it in-house, because the market already knows, the people in the know in those countries and internationally already know, probably sometimes before the IMF does, what's really happening. So it's not really to protect the markets, it's to protect either the institution or their process or whatever.
Yeah, that's the official line, often.
Yeah, that's often,
Sensitivity.
but I know of a very important report that was kept, at least one, several, but one that was really important during the crisis that was never actually got to the point of being published, just to keep it under wraps. So they didn't have to say it wasn't published, that it wasn't released, because it never got published.
Can I make a point about the political economy of these institutions?
Please.
You know, the reason things don't get published is because of the nature and structure of things like the IMF. Now, we talked about this yesterday in another session that Basma was chairing, taking, as an example, the evidence pertaining to the staff's views on Russia during the repeated and flawed burning of money that occurred in the 1990s. And that was entirely to do with the politics of the IMF as an institution. And that was to do with the goals of the major stakeholders of the IMF. And this is pretty well documented, and there's plenty of staff who've gone on the record and off the record to say so, because they got blamed for not identifying a crisis which they said was about to happen. And I think, with all due respect, I can't say that I share your counsel of despair regarding markets. And speaking as a person who's actually been a trader, I used to trade, emerging market equities.
So have I.
Yeah.
And futures and currency.
I really dispute the characterization of markets as homogeneous and intelligent. And I think if you want to look dispassionately at market actors over the last 15, 20 years, its prices are wrong, they're constantly wrong, and the few exceptional traders who make money know it.
That's correct, because those in the know already know. And because
I don't even think it's about privileged access to information. I think it's about, let's look at the political economy and structure of markets and what they're incentivized to achieve.
I think we could debate this forever.
Certainly we could, but the point is that as a result of this miasma of conflicting incentives, complex and heterogeneous and not monolithic institutions, it seems to me totally counterproductive to conclude that the lesson from the inability to perceive and adjust and address crises, and I'll give you one very recent example. I read report and study and warning after another about the exposure of Cypriot banks to the Greek bailout terms, the specifically December write-down. Not a thing was done. And people didn't want to deal with it. So I think it's not just a question of transparency and putting stuff on the record. It's also about the credibility of those institutions and their interrelation with other institutions that have these responsibilities. So I think, we need, it's great that this effort is being made, and I apologize I didn't come earlier for the presentation, but I'm familiar with your work. And I think that the fundamental, I would say this, I come from an institution that's a watchdog, but the idea that we can continue as we have done with a sort of presumption of confidentiality and a lot of political decisions being hidden behind market sensitivity justifications, as they have been historically, is no longer sustainable.
So, can I ask a question? How are you going to, whatever conclusions you come up with, whatever studies you have, how do you pass them on to the civil society in the countries around the world, I guess, for follow-up?
Suddenly represent all
What's your, you told me your list was 18,000 yesterday?
Yeah, but a lot of them are in this building.
I'm kidding.
I don't know, you should answer that question.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a good point, and we obviously want to take this, some of the comments that have been made today to further update and I think improve our assessment. But ultimately, I think we have something here that we want to improve the process, and we want to, I think, have more investment in this process. And I think that there's no I think exercise is going to be perfect for all the unknown and unintended consequences that is the political economy of the globe today. But I think it's worth trying, and it's in that vein that we really want to pursue this. And I'm hoping that we will have some receptivity within the IMF. I do hope that we might be able to get this at least as a discussion. Sometimes having a third party, a neutral third party, point out potential areas of or need for improvement is, I think, a positive thing. It's a constructive criticism, not meant to be, I think, undermining anything that's being done, but rather to say there are ways of improving this. And we take a very, I guess, in this particular perspective, a sort of an organizational behavior approach to this. You know, it's about the management of the process and not criticizing the people behind the process, but really ways of fostering better cooperation is in everyone's benefit, both for the IMF, FSB, and member countries. So I do hope that we'll try and get some ears and time of the IMF as we move forward, but part of it in getting CSO feedback was to really, you know, and the comments that we've received are just excellent in our, you know, attempt to frame it. We are preparing an academic piece, much lengthier. There is a more substantive paper behind this policy brief. The point of this was brevity, but we do have a more expansive paper that we'd love to share with others who would be interested in reading it and helping us revise it, and ultimately distribute it to a wider audience, especially the academic audience, which again doesn't know about this. I shouldn't say doesn't know, but may not know of this may fall under the radar for many of them. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time. Please visit us on CG Online. If you have any email lists that you would like us to distribute this to, if you have 18,000 email lists that you want to
share,
we can, we can email the PDF to you, and we would appreciate you passing it along to your list.
I have one more quick question to find out. So, do early warning can lead to panic for the market?
You know what? We came from the very same perspective that you're said here. But after talking to so many people in the private sector and the public sector, which do this already on multiple levels, it's just not there. You know, that's not a concern anymore. I think information communication technology has made this world so small in the passing along of information that, in fact, the absence of information is more of a risk. So the absence of information, the absence of sort of identifying what may be coming in 18 months is worse. At least that would prepare things and get, I think, more of the markets ready in cushioning the sort of hard landing. At the moment, I think what we have is really quite, I think, a troubling situation if we're just going to keep this, you know, all to ourselves.